Harrisonburg, Virginia, had a rhythm all its own. A mid-sized town tucked into the Shenandoah Valley, it thrived on a mix of college energy and small-town familiarity. Streets wove between brick buildings and tree-lined avenues, the occasional diner or coffee shop spilling warmth into the cool air. There was a quiet hum in the mornings, the low rumble of buses and cars, students hurrying to classes, baristas calling out names with practiced precision. But beneath the calm, there was a current of restless energy, a sense that anything could happen if you watched closely enough. And in this town moved Jennifer Quinn, 22, alive in ways that seemed to bend the world around her. If life had a rhythm, Jennifer danced to her own beat, chaotic, impulsive, vibrant. She thrived on freedom, on choice, on the thrill of not following the rules. People noticed her instantly, not just because of her beauty. Dark hair that caught the sunlight, eyes that seemed to take everything in, but because of the energy she carried. There was a warmth, a magnetic light, a boldness in her laughter that drew people in, made ordinary moments feel electric. Her apartment, above a small record store downtown, smelled faintly of coffee and jasmine, with scattered sketches and notebooks marking her presence. Mornings were for music, dancing alone in sunlight, letting life move around her while she moved within it. Jennifer was untamed, unpredictable, unapologetic. In Harrisonburg, a town balanced between tradition and youth, she was a spark that made everyone else feel more alive. Her family, in contrast, was complicated. Her parents loved her, but their marriage had cracks that trickled into the home in subtle, persistent ways. Arguments left long, cold silences, and her siblings learned early to navigate around tension that Jennifer sometimes pushed against, sometimes softened with humor and care. She held her family together in ways they didn't always notice, balancing chaos with affection, defiance with loyalty. And then there were her friends, a tight circle of artists, students, dreamers, people who thrived on late nights, minor adventures, and impulsive choices. Jennifer was the spark at the center, the one who led laughter, orchestrated the chaos, and made even the simplest evenings feel extraordinary. But beneath the smiles, subtle tension lingered. One friend, quietly jealous, watched Jennifer's joy with envy, hiding it behind laughter that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a quiet, patient envy, waiting for an opportunity that none of them could yet see. March had arrived with a chill in the air. The sky was pale gray over Harrisonburg, a faint scent of thawing earth in the streets. On that morning, Jennifer left her apartment with that familiar energy, pulling her jacket tight against the cold, stepping into the town that moved around her but never contained her. She smiled at neighbors, waved at the barista who knew her order by heart, and carried herself like the day was hers to shape. At the corner cafe, the group of friends was already gathered. Steam rose from mugs, conversations overlapped in pleasant chaos, the hum of life threading through laughter. Jennifer entered, and the room seemed to tilt toward her energy. She joked, teased, laughed. She moved through the space like she owned it, and in a way, she did. She brought light, warmth, chaos, and freedom wherever she went, unaware that forces quietly simmered just outside her perception. Among them, her jealous friend blended seamlessly, her envy masked by smiles, gestures, and laughter that mirrored Jennifer's. Jennifer, trusting and open, didn't see it, rarely did. Her ability to see the good in people, to assume kindness, was part of her charm, and part of the vulnerability that would soon shape the story no one in Harrisonburg could forget. The town moved on around her, unaware that the chaos Jennifer thrived in would soon collide with darkness. In cafes, on streets, in apartments above record stores, life continued, but in one corner, a spark of energy, freedom, and unrestrained joy moved through Harrisonburg, completely unaware of the events that would soon transform it forever. Jennifer Quinn was alive, chaotic, free. And it was in that freedom, that energy, that her story would begin. The story that would grip a town, haunt her family, and leave echoes that no one would ever forget. The morning of March 1st, 1999, dawned like any other in Harrisonburg. The streets were damp from a light overnight drizzle, the sky a pale gray that promised nothing more than a chill lingering in the air. College students rushed along sidewalks, coffee cups in hand, while older residents moved at a slower pace, their lives measured and routine. Yet for Jennifer Quinn, this ordinary morning held the kind of energy she carried into every day, a sense that anything could happen, and she would meet it with a laugh, a joke, and a spark of mischief. Jennifer left her apartment earlier than usual, energized by a restless excitement she couldn't quite explain. She wrapped her favorite jacket tightly around her and stepped out into the cold, the familiar streets of Harrisonburg buzzing quietly around her. The sun struggled to push through the clouds, catching the edges of her dark hair as she walked, and for a moment the ordinary town felt like it had shifted, all in sync with her presence. She stopped briefly to wave at the barista at the cafe below her building, whose smile reflected years of memorized orders and quiet familiarity. "The usual?" the barista asked, already reaching for the cup. Jennifer grinned, nodding, and with a wave moved along, her pace quick, purposeful, light. By mid-morning she had joined her friends at their regular meeting spot, a cafe tucked into one of Harrisonburg's quieter streets, where the smell of brewing coffee mingled with the faint scent of old books from the neighboring shop. The group was already assembled, laughing and teasing each other as they planned the night ahead. A small party at a friend's apartment. Music, drinks, the kind of carefree chaos Jennifer thrived on. She slid into her seat, exchanging hugs and playful shoves, her laughter spilling out across the table, carrying a warmth that made everything around her feel brighter. Her friends talked, debated, joked, and occasionally argued over trivial things. Who could drink the most, who had the worst taste in music? But through it all, Jennifer was the center, the spark. Her energy drew everyone in, even as it highlighted the cracks beneath the surface. Among them, one friend watched her a little too closely. She laughed when Jennifer laughed, nodded when Jennifer spoke, but there was a sharpness in her gaze, a quiet envy that no one else seemed to notice. The afternoon passed in a blur of errands, coffee refills, and laughter echoing through the streets. Jennifer stopped by her favorite record store, chatting with the owner about new arrivals, flipping through vinyl covers with an easy grace. People in the store noticed her. It was impossible not to. She moved with a kind of freedom that was rare, her presence lighting up the small shop, making everyone who came in feel more awake, more alive. She bought a record or two, careful to select the ones she knew would carry her through the evening, a soundtrack for what she assumed would be just another night of fun. By late afternoon, they regrouped at the cafe to finalize plans. Jennifer's friends debated which route they would take to the party, who would drive, who would bring what. The air carried excitement, teasing, and a faint tension. Jennifer didn't notice. Small, almost invisible gestures from the friend whose envy simmered beneath the surface. The plans were simple, almost mundane, but as Jennifer gathered her things, zipped her jacket, and prepared to leave, the first subtle shift occurred. A drink offered. A suggestion whispered under the hum of conversation. Something so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But in that moment, it marked the beginning of a chain of events that would change everything. Jennifer left the cafe with her friends, their laughter spilling onto the streets of Harrisonburg, blending with the hum of cars and the distant chatter of the evening. She felt alive, free, completely herself. She didn't notice the friend lingering slightly behind, a small smile masking the envy that had been growing quietly for months. There was no malice in her mind, only excitement for the night ahead, a night of music, dancing, and the kind of chaos she loved. The last hours before her disappearance were ordinary in almost every sense. They stopped at a small convenience store, bought snacks, joked with strangers, and mapped out their route to the party. The energy was vibrant, the town alive around them. Jennifer laughed easily, teasing her friends, sharing stories, leaning into the freedom of the moment, blissfully unaware that a single choice, driven by envy and opportunity, was about to alter everything. As the evening approached, shadows lengthened in the streets of Harrisonburg. The air grew colder, a light wind brushing through the town. Jennifer's friends piled into cars, music spilling from open windows, and she slid into her seat with the same carefree energy she had carried all day. They drove toward the party, the city lights flickering past, laughter and music blending in a soundtrack to an ordinary night. And in that ordinary night, everything shifted. Jennifer Quinn, vibrant, free, alive, was walking into the unknown. The chaos she loved so much, the freedom that defined her, was about to collide with a hidden darkness. A simple drink offered by someone she trusted, a single moment of jealousy unspoken, was enough. And in that moment her world began to unravel in ways no one in Harrisonburg could have imagined. The town moved on around her, unaware of the storm gathering at its edges. But Jennifer's energy, her laughter, her spirit, they left traces that would guide investigators, haunt her family, and mark the town forever. That night, a free spirit would vanish, and Harrisonburg would hold its breath for what was to come. Night had settled over Harrisonburg like a soft blanket, the streets dim and quiet in comparison to the day's chaos. The town's familiar hum, the occasional car, distant laughter, and the muted sound of a television from someone's window was there, but it felt smaller somehow, fragile, as if the world itself had paused to watch what was about to unfold. For Jennifer Quinn, the evening began as it always did, alive, laughing, full of energy, the center of every room she entered. The party was in an apartment just off Main Street, in a building that had seen better days. The paint on the walls was chipped, the floors creaked underfoot, and the lights flickered slightly, as if the space itself were uncertain about who it welcomed. Inside, music pulsed, laughter bounced off the walls, and the smell of beer and perfume mingled in the air. Friends crowded the living room, spilling onto the small balcony, where the night air was cold but invigorating. Jennifer moved through it effortlessly, a bright presence among dim corners, drawing people toward her with that magnetic energy she carried. Her friends settled around her, chatting, joking, teasing one another as they always did. Drinks were passed, hands brushed, and the night seemed ordinary, safe, alive. Yet in the background, someone watched differently. Her friend, the one whose envy had grown quietly over months, kept close, offering a smile, laughing when Jennifer laughed, but carrying a subtle intent beneath the surface. It was almost imperceptible to anyone else, but it was there. A moment of planning wrapped in the guise of camaraderie, hidden behind the routine gestures of friendship. Jennifer's attention shifted constantly, as it always did. She teased one friend, pulled another into a conversation, and laughed at a story that made everyone else roll their eyes. The apartment seemed smaller than it was, because her energy filled every corner. No one would have imagined that, within the hour, the laughter would be replaced by silence, the chaos by fear. The first step came quietly, almost invisibly. A drink was offered, an innocent gesture, a cup handed over with a smile and a joke. Jennifer accepted, trusting, open, unaware of the subtle change that had been engineered moments before. She took a sip, the taste familiar, comforting, nothing to hint at the danger hidden within. The room continued around her, music blaring, laughter echoing, as if the world had not shifted at all. But it had. The first ripple of disaster moved silently through her body, unseen and undetectable in the chaos of the night. Jennifer laughed again, brushed off a comment, leaned toward a friend to share a story. But slowly, imperceptibly, the effects of what had been added to her drink began to take hold. Her movements grew slightly sluggish. Her words caught briefly in her throat. She blinked a few times, feeling the room tilt in a way that was unfamiliar, uncomfortable. Friends noticed a subtle change, but in the energy of the party it seemed momentary, a brief stumble, nothing alarming enough to warrant concern. The friend whose envy had orchestrated this moment remained close, a quiet observer, her own presence an invisible weight. No one suspected her. No one imagined that the energy in the room had been manipulated, that a small act of jealousy had become the opening to disaster. Jennifer's free spirit, her trust, her openness, it had made her beloved, magnetic, alive, but it had also made her vulnerable in ways she could not yet understand. Minutes passed, the effects growing stronger. Jennifer attempted to steady herself, laughed off the dizziness, tried to convince herself it was nothing, just the excitement of the night. But soon, the room became a blur, voices overlapping in incomprehensible layers, music thudding too loudly against her chest. Her friends noticed now, concern flickered across faces. But before they could act, before anyone could intervene, Jennifer's world contracted. She followed a suggestion, subtle and unassuming, to step aside for a moment. The night, the music, the laughter, all ordinary, slipped from her awareness. And in that instant, someone guided her away from the crowd, away from safety, with hands that were gentle but insistent, masks of care hiding intentions far darker than the evening had ever held. Jennifer, trusting, unaware, allowed herself to be led. The apartment, once full of warmth and light, became distant. Friends called out, voices distant echoes, growing fainter as the minutes stretched. Harrisonburg's streets outside were quiet, the chill of the early March night pressing in. Jennifer Quinn, the chaotic, vibrant, free-spirited center of every room she entered, was being removed from the world she had always navigated with such ease. It was over almost before anyone realized. The energy of the night had shifted completely. Laughter gave way to silence, music to a distant hum. The friend whose envy had set the events in motion returned to the party, her mask firmly in place, smiling and laughing as if nothing had occurred. No one suspected the truth. No one imagined that Jennifer's absence had begun, not as a disappearance, not as a moment of chance, but as a carefully engineered act of jealousy and opportunity. And so, the night moved on, the party eventually dispersing, unaware that in the shadows, Jennifer's world had already changed forever. Harrisonburg, usually alive with quiet movement, held its breath without knowing it, as a free spirit had begun a journey into darkness. For Jennifer Quinn, the night that had promised chaos, freedom, and laughter became the beginning of a nightmare that would grip her family, challenge investigators, and haunt the town for months to come. The hours after Jennifer Quinn vanished stretched in ways that were both slow and sharp, piercing through the ordinary life of Harrisonburg like an unwelcome chill. At first the night seemed ordinary, unremarkable. The apartment emptied gradually, laughter fading, music dying down, and the town returned to its usual rhythm, the quiet hum of streets, the occasional honk of a car, the faint murmur of a television through apartment windows. It wasn't until the early morning that the first unease began to creep in. Jennifer hadn't returned home. Her phone, usually buzzing with texts from friends, messages from her parents, remained silent. Her apartment, usually alive with movement, warmth, and light, was quiet. Her parents called her friends, the ones who had been with her the night before. Their voices carried concern, then panic, as repeated calls yielded nothing. The first person to notice the absence in a concrete way was her roommate. Jennifer's bed had not been slept in, her bag still by the door, her jacket hanging where she'd left it. Something in the stillness felt wrong, heavy, almost accusatory. It wasn't just the absence of movement. It was the absence of energy. The spark that had always filled the apartment, the chaos that had defined Jennifer, was gone. And in that emptiness, the weight of fear began to press. Her parents arrived soon after, their concern escalating with every unanswered call, every empty reply from friends who had seen her last. They searched her apartment, her usual haunts, the cafes, the record store where she worked part-time, the streets she walked every day. The town that had always felt familiar and safe now seemed alien, edges sharper, shadows longer. Harrisonburg's streets had not changed, but Jennifer's absence made them feel colder, emptier, haunted. The first official alert came mid-morning when the police were called. Officers arrived at Jennifer's apartment, professional but concerned, aware that when a 22-year-old vanished without explanation, every minute mattered. They asked questions, took notes, and tried to piece together a timeline. Friends were questioned repeatedly, their recollections jumbled by alcohol, laughter, and the chaos of the night. What seemed like small, ordinary details, the moment she stepped aside, the friend who had lingered, were lost in memory, unnoticed until later reflection. Harrisonburg itself reacted quietly at first. It was the kind of town where people watched each other, knew each other's habits, and expected ordinary things to remain ordinary. Jennifer's disappearance shattered that expectation. Neighbors who had seen her smiling in the morning now whispered in doorways, speculating in hushed tones, fearing the unseen. Cafes that had been alive with chatter felt subdued. The energy that Jennifer brought into the streets, the laughter she carried into every corner, had vanished, leaving a palpable void. As the day stretched into afternoon, search efforts began. Officers canvassed streets, knocked on doors, followed leads that led nowhere, listened to anxious tips from neighbors. Flyers with Jennifer's photo appeared, her vibrant smile capturing the attention and worry of anyone who saw it. Her parents distributed them themselves, driving through neighborhoods, speaking to strangers with voices tight with desperation, eyes red from sleepless nights. Every corner of Harrisonburg seemed familiar yet alien, every shadow suspicious, every alley a potential clue. Friends were questioned again and again, They recounted the night, the music, the laughter, the last cup Jennifer had sipped, but no one could pinpoint exactly what had happened, only that something had changed. Something subtle, a moment unnoticed, had shifted the balance of an ordinary evening into terror. The quiet envy of one friend, the small, calculated act that had gone unnoticed, would only be understood later, when the pieces of the night began to come together. By evening, the town had begun to realize the gravity of the situation. Jennifer Quinn, the chaotic, vibrant spirit who had lit up Harrisonburg, was missing. The energy she had carried into every corner of the town was absent. Silence replaced laughter, worry replaced casual greetings, and in that shift the town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, unsure, fearful. Her parents stayed at her apartment, calling her name, pacing the small space, their hearts tightening with each passing hour. Friends searched, whispered, and waited, the anxiety of uncertainty gnawing at their edges. Harrisonburg had never known fear like this, not for one of its own. And as night fell again, darker and heavier than before, it became clear that Jennifer Quinn's disappearance was no ordinary event. It was a disappearance that would draw the town into a collective worry, grip her family with unrelenting grief, and start a chain of investigation, reflection, and tension that would stretch over months. The ordinary town, with its quiet streets and familiar corners, had become the stage for a mystery that no one could yet comprehend. And for Jennifer Quinn, the vibrant, free spirit, the ordinary night had been irrevocably broken. The morning after Jennifer Quinn disappeared carried a weight that no one in Harrisonburg could shake. Sunlight filtered weakly through overcast skies, casting the streets in a dull, gray light. Officers fanned out across the town, moving methodically, yet each step carried urgency. A 22-year-old missing in a town that prided itself on familiarity was an anomaly, a disruption that demanded attention, and, even more, explanation. At Jennifer's apartment, detectives meticulously catalogued the scene. Nothing appeared forced, no signs of struggle in the doorway or living room, no broken locks, no overturned furniture. Yet the absence of Jennifer herself created an invisible tension that made everything feel off balance. Her belongings were in order, her bag by the door, the traces of her morning routine still lingering. Whoever had taken her, or whoever had caused her disappearance, had done so without leaving obvious signs. The initial interviews with friends were slow, careful, and frustrating. They recalled her laughter, the music, the light-hearted arguments over trivial things, the plans for the party, the minor chaos of the evening. But memories were fuzzy, details blurred by the energy of the night. They remembered the friend whose envy seemed subtle, but now felt like a shadow in hindsight. Small actions that had seemed inconsequential at the time. A smile too tight, a glance held too long, a suggestion whispered and followed, but nothing concrete. No one could pinpoint what had gone wrong, or how. Detectives expanded the search, interviewing neighbors, canvassing nearby streets, reviewing the cameras from convenience stores and traffic lights along Jennifer's path. The footage was grainy, partial. Moments of her walking, her silhouette among passing cars, but no clear clue as to what had happened once she left the party. Every lead was frustrating, every dead end a reminder that this was not going to be an easy case. Harrisonburg, a town used to ordinary rhythms, was suddenly a puzzle box filled with shadows and half-truths. Meanwhile, Jennifer's parents became both the heart of hope and the epicenter of despair. Their calls to friends, repeated drives through town, and visits to local gathering places were tinged with desperation, fear, and disbelief. Each time they caught a glimpse of someone resembling their daughter, their hearts raced, only to fall again in crushing disappointment. Hours blurred into days, and the relentless search began to etch itself into their features. Sleepless nights, haggard expressions, voices tight with tension. The media soon caught wind of the case. Local news anchors delivered updates in clipped, serious tones, while cameras captured the small, familiar streets now transformed into scenes of concern and speculation. Flyers went up on telephone poles, in store windows, and on college bulletin boards. Jennifer's vibrant smile, frozen in a photograph, contrasted painfully with the worry that had gripped everyone who knew her. Harrisonburg's normal, quiet life was replaced by whispered theories, anxious glances, and the communal fear of a town whose rhythm had been broken. Detectives began to trace Jennifer's last known movements meticulously. They reconstructed her path, the cafe where she'd met friends, the brief stop at the record store, the apartment building where the party took place. Small inconsistencies emerged in witness statements, subtle contradictions that hinted at more than just a night gone wrong. But nothing definitive, no sign of the person who had orchestrated the moment, no clear clue as to where Jennifer had been taken. The friend whose jealousy had set events in motion remained quiet, cooperative, smiling in public, her envy invisible to everyone but the detective's slow, careful probing. Even if suspicion flickered, there was no evidence yet to connect her to the disappearance. The subtle act, a spiked drink, a manipulated suggestion, a step away from the crowd, left little trace. It was a crime built on patience, invisibility, and opportunity, hidden beneath layers of normality. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to feel like moving through a fog. Leads dried up, witnesses recounted moments that conflicted with each other, and Harrisonburg grew quieter, more anxious. Police remained vigilant, continuing to interview friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen something unusual. But the truth, the raw, undeniable fact of what had happened, was buried beneath the ordinary, waiting to emerge in ways no one could yet predict. And all the while, Jennifer Quinn remained missing. The free-spirited, chaotic, vibrant young woman who had lit up the town was gone. Harrisonburg held its breath. The town's streets, once alive with the subtle energy of ordinary life, now carried an undercurrent of fear, uncertainty, and grief. In the shadows of the investigation, subtle truths lingered. A jealous friend, unnoticed at first, had orchestrated the opening act, a carefully spiked drink, step taken at the right moment, the manipulation of trust. It was there, hidden, invisible to all but the sharpest eyes. But in those first weeks, no one knew. For Jennifer's family, for her friends, for Harrisonburg itself, hope and fear existed side by side, tangled and inescapable. The investigation had begun, but the case was far from solved. Every day without Jennifer added weight to the questions, deepened the uncertainty, and etched pain into the hearts of those who loved her. Harrisonburg had been changed, subtly but irreversibly, by the disappearance of one young woman whose freedom, energy, and spirit had made her unforgettable. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Harrisonburg's streets, once alive with ordinary chatter, gradually returned to their usual rhythm, but the absence of Jennifer Quinn remained a palpable void. Every corner, every familiar place she had frequented, held a silent question. Where had she gone? Her parents carried the weight of uncertainty like an unrelenting shadow. Their days were consumed by calls to the police, drives through the town, visits to friends and neighbors, all in the desperate hope of finding some clue, some hint, some trace of Jennifer. Sleep became rare, meals hurried and forgotten. Each unanswered call, each lead that led nowhere, gnawed at them, eroding the edges of hope and sharpening the ache of grief. Friends of Jennifer struggled as well. The small circle that had once shared laughter and chaos now shared anxiety and sorrow. They recounted the night repeatedly, dissecting conversations, glances, and gestures in search of the moment when something had gone wrong. But the truth remained obscured by memory, by the subtle manipulations of the night, by the jealousy that had set events in motion. Their conversations became a mix of frustration, guilt, and helplessness. They wished they had noticed sooner, done something differently, saved her in ways they could only imagine. Investigators faced their own set of frustrations. Every lead seemed to dissolve. Every witness recollection conflicted with another. The technological tools of the time were limited. DNA evidence could be tested, fingerprints analyzed, but without a clear suspect or scene, progress was painfully slow. Police pored over surveillance footage, followed up on every tip, interviewed anyone who might have been near the apartment the night Jennifer disappeared. Hours of effort led to a few faint possibilities, none of which yielded actionable results. The case began to stagnate, the investigation growing heavier under the pressure of time. Harrisonburg itself became a town holding its breath. The community had known Jennifer, her laughter, her chaotic energy, her light that had touched so many. Local businesses displayed flyers, posted photos of her bright smile, and quietly hoped for news that never came. The conversations in cafes and shops carried a hushed tone, an unspoken anxiety. People wondered if the town had somehow failed her, if the ordinary places she had trusted had become unsafe. Even as the months passed, a subtle suspicion lingered, small, almost imperceptible, a whisper beneath the surface of the investigation. The friend whose envy had orchestrated the initial act remained outwardly composed, polite, cooperative. But for those who remembered details from that night, a quiet unease grew. Something didn't fit. A glance, a gesture, a memory of the drink offered, small fragments that seemed harmless at first, now took on a new weight. Yet nothing could be proven. Nothing could yet connect these subtle details to the disappearance. The family's relationships, once complicated but steady, began to shift under the weight of grief and uncertainty. Arguments that had seemed monumental before became trivial in the shadow of losing Jennifer. Siblings drew closer, parents leaned on each other despite years of tension, and the pain of uncertainty forced them into a fragile unity. Life paused for 6 months, measured not by normal rhythms, but by moments of hope, disappointment, and relentless questioning. Time passed differently during this period. Each day began with cautious optimism and ended with crushing despair. The town continued, but the family's calendar had become the investigation itself. Hours spent waiting by the phone, meetings with detectives, interviews, and endless drives in search of anything that might lead to Jennifer. Sleep came in fitful bursts, dreams haunted by her smile and laughter, and every sound in the house, the creak of a floorboard, the ring of the phone, was both a hope and a warning. For the investigators, months without progress were demoralizing. Files grew thicker, maps filled with annotations, and theories multiplied without confirmation. They revisited the initial timeline countless times, scrutinized the night of the party, and tried to identify any pattern or clue that had been overlooked. Every day brought the same frustrating reality: a missing young woman, a town full of witnesses, and a trail that seemed to vanish the moment it was followed. Through all of this, the subtle tension surrounding Jennifer's friends persisted quietly. The one whose envy had been the catalyst for her disappearance remained a shadow in every recounting of the night. Investigators noted small inconsistencies, unintentional slips, memories that didn't quite align. But in the absence of physical evidence or confession, these threads were frustratingly intangible, waiting to be unraveled months or even years later. Harrisonburg, for its part, adapted to a new rhythm. The town remembered Jennifer in quiet ways: a poster in a cafe, a memorial in a park, conversations that lingered in hallways and classrooms. Her absence became a constant presence, a ghost that reminded everyone of fragility, vulnerability, and the hidden dangers beneath ordinary life. The months stretched on, tense and heavy, and for her family, friends, and the town itself, the reality of a missing Jennifer Quinn became a defining shadow, shaping every interaction, every memory, every hope. By the 6th month, the case had hardened into a cold one, not forgotten, not abandoned, but locked behind walls of frustration, missing clues and time. Yet even in that stillness, faint threads of hope remained. A detail remembered too late, a witness who might speak, a truth waiting for the right moment. The town, the family, and the investigators held on to that hope, each heartbeat echoing the question that had grown impossible to silence. Where was Jennifer Quinn? 6 months had passed since Jennifer Quinn vanished, and Harrisonburg had begun to live under a different light, a town forever colored by absence. The streets moved on. People resumed routines, yet in every quiet corner, the memory of her disappearance lingered, palpable and inescapable. For her family, each day without answers was a fresh ache, a reminder that the vibrant, chaotic spirit of their daughter had been stolen from them. Investigators, frustrated by dead ends and limited tools, were searching for anything that could finally break the case open. It came unexpectedly. A subtle, almost imperceptible clue, buried within the routine work of the detectives, finally surfaced. Advances in forensic science, DNA testing, more sensitive detection methods, and database cross-references had opened doors that had seemed permanently closed 6 months ago. A piece of evidence collected at the apartment during the initial investigation, a trace that had once been dismissed as inconclusive, was now ready to tell its story. The labs confirmed it. The presence of an unidentified male's DNA, faint but undeniable, found on the cup Jennifer had last touched. The news electrified the investigation team. A name could not yet be attached, But the trail was no longer cold. The DNA provided a starting point, a path that could, with patience and precision, unravel the mystery that had haunted Harrisonburg for half a year. The detectives knew the importance of acting methodically. They cross-referenced the DNA with local and state databases, examined possible connections, and started building the framework for what could become a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Jennifer's family clung to cautious hope. Every new lead brought a mix of fear and anticipation, the heart's instinct to hope colliding with months of grief. Her parents spent long nights discussing possibilities, replaying every detail of that night in their minds, wondering how something so ordinary could have turned into months of anguish. Each breakthrough, no matter how technical or procedural, became a beacon, a fragile light in a dark landscape. The investigators followed every lead. The DNA results prompted them to examine people in Jennifer's circle more closely, revisiting interviews, scrutinizing behaviors, and re-examining the subtle inconsistencies from the night she disappeared. The friend whose envy had quietly orchestrated the events suddenly came under greater attention. While nothing yet proved her involvement, the detective saw the small, overlooked pieces beginning to form a pattern. The last drink, the whispered suggestion, the moments when Jennifer had been guided away. The breakthrough didn't come with fanfare. It arrived quietly, in a methodical sequence of verification, analysis, and cross-referencing. But for those following the case, it was seismic. The technology that had seemed distant, perhaps even unnecessary during the early frantic search, had now become the key to unraveling the mystery. Investigators finally had something tangible, a bread strong enough to pull. Harrisonburg's quiet corners began to stir with renewed attention. Flyers remained on bulletin boards, but now they carried the weight of potential resolution. News outlets, previously reporting only on absence and worry, started to cover the potential breakthrough, hinting at progress after months of dead ends. The town, so used to the frozen weight of uncertainty, felt a subtle shift, the sense that the nightmare might have finally moved toward an answer. The detectives methodically followed the thread, building connections between the DNA, local records, and subtle behavioral clues that had been overlooked. Each step was careful, deliberate, and measured. This was a case that demanded precision, patience, and respect for the complexity of the web surrounding Jennifer's disappearance. Every small discovery fueled a larger investigation, and with each new fact, the outlines of the mystery began to emerge from the shadows. Jennifer's friends were questioned again, under the meticulous lens of detectives trained to notice subtleties, to recognize when memories aligned with evidence and when they did not. Small contradictions, forgotten moments, and gestures that seemed trivial suddenly gained weight. The puzzle pieces that had remained scattered for months were finally starting to lock into place. For her family, every day carried the mixture of fear and anticipation. The breakthrough did not bring Jennifer back, nor did it erase the 6 months of absence, but it gave hope, a tangible thread that could lead to truth. Their hearts, raw from months of grief, were fragile, yet they clung to the possibility that the nightmare could end, that the vibrant, free-spirited daughter they loved might be found and returned, or that justice could finally follow. The breakthrough marked a shift. From months of paralysis, uncertainty, and dead ends to focused action. Investigators were no longer chasing shadows. They had a trail, a direction, and a clue that promised resolution. Harrisonburg, the quiet town that had held its breath for half a year, finally felt the stirrings of momentum. Jennifer Quinn, though still missing, was no longer lost in the void. The invisible threads of her disappearance, woven through jealousy, opportunity, and quiet manipulation, were beginning to unravel. And as the detectives traced the leads, followed the DNA, and pieced together the subtle evidence, the town, her family, and even her friends felt the first flicker of hope in 6 long, dark months. The moment the breakthrough came, the investigation shifted into high gear. The faint DNA trail, once buried in months of overlooked evidence, now pulsed with possibility. Detectives retraced steps, re-examined testimonies, and meticulously connected every small detail that had previously slipped through the cracks. Harrisonburg's quiet streets, familiar and comforting, now seemed like a labyrinth of questions, each corner hiding a clue, each shadow a potential revelation. Investigators began reconstructing the night of Jennifer's disappearance with surgical precision. They reviewed interviews with friends and neighbors, focusing not only on what people said, but what they had failed to notice in the chaos of that ordinary party night. The small inconsistencies, the fleeting glance, the whispered suggestion, the minor hesitation, began to line up. Patterns emerged from the haze. Jennifer's last steps, her interactions, even the timing of her movements were reconstructed, creating a map of her journey into danger. The friend whose envy had quietly orchestrated the events was scrutinized again. Nothing definitive connected her to Jennifer's disappearance yet, but detectives were increasingly attentive to the small details she had overlooked or misremembered. Her demeanor, polite and cooperative on the surface, contained subtle cracks, hesitations, fleeting expressions of guilt, and a tendency to over-explain the night's events. These fragments, once dismissed as normal anxiety, were now pieces of a larger puzzle. For Jennifer's family, the renewed focus brought a mixture of relief and dread. Every small lead carried the possibility of closure, and the haunting risk of confirming their worst fears. Days were filled with anxious waiting, their hope tethered tightly to the progress of the detectives. They spoke little, conserving their energy, haunted by the months of absence and uncertainty. Yet in private moments, they clung to the fragile belief that Jennifer might be found alive, that the nightmare could be reversed. Detectives expanded the search beyond Harrisonburg. They examined rental records, unusual patterns in the area, and the movements of individuals connected to Jennifer's social circle. Every lead, no matter how minor, was followed. Investigators began to consider the possibility of an unstable individual acting alone, someone whose personal life or obsessions might explain Jennifer's sudden disappearance. The evidence pointed toward a careful, calculating isolation. Someone who manipulated the night's events, using subtle means to remove Jennifer from her familiar environment. It was painstaking work. Hours of interviews, analysis of small gestures, and painstaking cross-referencing of local records slowly narrowed the circle. Investigators retraced Jennifer's known path, checking every place she had visited: the cafe, the record store, the apartment building. They combed through overlooked tips, old sightings, and minor inconsistencies in witness accounts. Each discovery, each minor detail, added to a picture that was becoming clearer, but the final truth still remained frustratingly out of reach. One lead, however, began to focus the investigation sharply: a location outside the city, a remote property known only to a few locals where unusual activity had been reported. When detectives traced the DNA evidence further, patterns in phone records and delivery logs suggested that someone had been receiving visitors or shipments in secret, hidden from public view. The image of a normal, familiar Harrisonburg citizen began to blur into something more sinister, an individual capable of holding Jennifer in isolation, someone whose personal history suggested instability and obsession. The town remained unaware of the depth of the investigation. Locals continued their routines, passing the same streets and shops, unaware that investigators were closing in, threading the final connections that had been invisible for months. For her friends and family, every call from detectives was charged with tension, possibility and dread entangled in a single thread. Each new detail was a step closer to answers, but also a step closer to the harsh reality they feared might be confirmed. Detectives pursued leads that took them through the quiet outskirts of Harrisonburg, unremarkable roads that hid extraordinary danger. They coordinated with state and local authorities, tracing digital footprints, delivery records, and environmental clues, piecing together a profile of the person who had orchestrated Jennifer's disappearance. The pattern suggested obsession, an unstable individual acting out of loneliness, projection, and a fixation that had festered over time. As the investigation neared the breakthrough point, the detectives had a chilling realization. The person responsible had been living among them, ordinary on the surface, blending seamlessly into Harrisonburg's community. A neighbor, a local worker, someone whose life appeared routine and benign, but beneath the calm exterior was a hidden world, a secret that had held Jennifer captive for months. For the family, the tension was unbearable. Every call, every update, every tip carried the weight of potential closure and terror. Days blurred into nights, hope and fear intermingling until they were indistinguishable. Yet the faint thread of evidence, the DNA, the inconsistencies, the behaviors, was enough to give the detectives direction. Jennifer Quinn's story was no longer stalled in uncertainty. The truth, painful and terrifying, was within reach. Harrisonburg, still quiet on the surface, was poised for revelation. The town that had held its breath for 6 months was about to learn that the missing young woman was not lost in the chaos of chance, but trapped by a calculated, obsessive hand. And as investigators closed in on the property, retracing steps and connecting dots invisible for half a year, the edge of the mystery began to crack, revealing the chilling reality of what had happened to Jennifer Quinn. The final hours before discovery carried a tension that was almost unbearable. Detectives approached the property on the outskirts of Harrisonburg with the precision of a team prepared for confrontation, yet their hearts were heavy with the knowledge of what might lie behind the door. Months of investigation had led them here, through faint DNA traces, subtle behavioral inconsistencies, and a painstaking reconstruction of Jennifer Quinn's disappearance. Every detail pointed to one shocking reality. She had been held captive, hidden in plain sight, by someone whose life seemed ordinary on the surface. The man they confronted had been, to the town, nothing remarkable. He was known to neighbors as quiet, solitary, unassuming, someone who lived a life of normal routine. Yet within his home, hidden from public view, was a world of obsession and tragedy. Inside, Jennifer had been held for months, restrained physically and psychologically, trapped by the memory of someone he had lost, projected onto her in horrifying ways. The captor's instability, fueled by loneliness and grief, had transformed admiration into imprisonment. When detectives entered the property, the scene confirmed every terrible suspicion. Jennifer, alive but traumatized, emerged from the shadows, her free spirit dimmed but not extinguished. The months of captivity had left marks. Physical, yes, but more profoundly, the psychological weight of being controlled, threatened, and objectified. The horror of the situation was compounded by the realization that the man had targeted her not only because she had been an opportunity, but because she reminded him of someone he had lost. The resemblance had become a dangerous fixation, driving him to isolate her completely. The initial moments of confrontation were careful, measured. Detectives spoke in calm, firm tones, ensuring Jennifer's safety while securing the perpetrator. For Jennifer, the mixture of relief, fear, and disbelief was overwhelming. Months of uncertainty, fear, and isolation culminated in a moment that was both terrifying and liberating. The captor, confronted by law enforcement, revealed the depth of his instability and obsession, his actions explained only by a fractured mind and a life consumed by loss. For her family, the news of Jennifer's location was simultaneously devastating and euphoric. 6 months of grief, longing, and unanswered questions ended in a chaotic rush of emotion. They rushed to her side, their hearts breaking and mending at once as they saw her alive. The emotional reunion was raw, tears mingling with laughter, relief entwined with shock. Every hug, every whispered word carried the weight of months of absence, months of fear, and months of imagined horrors. The investigation quickly transitioned from search documentation and evidence collection. Detectives meticulously recorded the scene, capturing every detail of the property, the methods used to isolate Jennifer, and the evidence that tied the captor to the months of disappearance. DNA, digital records, behavioral inconsistencies, and confessions all coalesced into an airtight case, leaving no room for ambiguity. The horror of what had been endured was matched only by the meticulous, careful work required to ensure justice could follow. Harrisonburg reacted in waves. The town, once holding its breath in uncertainty, now processed shock, horror, and relief. The ordinary man, hidden among them, had caused months of suffering. Yet Jennifer's survival, her presence returned to the world of the living, became a symbol of resilience, a testament to her strength and spirit despite months of captivity and trauma. For Jennifer, the path forward was complicated. Trauma lingered, a cast in shadows shaped by months of fear, abuse, and control. Yet even in those early days of freedom, glimmers of the person she had been, the chaotic, vibrant, free spirit, reappeared. Her laughter, though tempered, returned. Her presence, though cautious, began to fill rooms once more. She had endured horrors unimaginable, yet she remained herself, even if fractured by experience. The captor's arrest, swift and decisive, brought the long-awaited confrontation with justice. He was charged with kidnapping, abuse, and related crimes, his calm exterior in public dissolving under the weight of evidence and the reality of his actions. Harrisonburg's legal system, slow to mobilize at first, now moved with certainty, ensuring the man who had caused such pain could not harm another. For Jennifer's family, the months of uncertainty became a timeline of survival and reunion. The ordeal that had fractured them in grief now forced them to come together in healing. The fear, the anguish, and the relentless weight gave way to gratitude, love, and a deep, renewed connection. They witnessed Jennifer reclaiming herself piece by piece, her strength an anchor for the family that had weathered so much pain in her absence. And as Harrisonburg returned to a semblance of normalcy, the town carried the indelible mark of Jennifer Quinn's ordeal. The ordinary streets, the familiar corners, the quiet cafes, they all remembered the shadow of fear, the ripple of absence, and finally, the relief of discovery. The young woman whose free spirit had once defined every space she entered had endured months of terror, yet emerged alive, a survivor of circumstance, fate, and human fragility. The courtroom was a space where months of tension, fear, and grief converged into a single heavy moment. Harrisonburg's residents followed the proceedings with a mix of fascination and dread, aware that the man who had held Jennifer Quinn captive for 6 months was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The ordinary life of a quiet town collided with extraordinary horror, and every detail of the trial reminded the community of the fragility and resilience of human experience. For Jennifer, the trial was a complex, overwhelming terrain. Sitting in the courtroom, recounting details of her captivity, her voice trembled, but never broke. Every description of the months she had endured, the manipulation, the abuse, the isolation, was balanced with the clarity and strength she had fought to reclaim. She did not speak with bitterness alone. She spoke with a quiet power, demonstrating a resilience that left both spectators and legal professionals in awe. Her family sat close, a unified front forged through months of trauma and relief. The fear that had haunted them for half a year remained just beneath the surface, but it was tempered by gratitude, by hope, and by a collective commitment to stand beside Jennifer as she told her story. Every moment of testimony was both harrowing and cathartic, allowing the truth to be shared, the horror confronted, and the long-awaited justice to begin taking shape. The prosecution laid out the case with meticulous detail. DNA evidence, witness testimonies, timelines, and the perpetrator's own statements painted a damning picture. Each fact highlighted the deliberate nature of the crime, the manipulation of a party night, the subtle orchestration of isolation, the premeditated obsession that had driven the abduction. The captor's actions, hidden in plain sight for months, were now fully visible to the courtroom, stripped of ambiguity or excuse. The defense tried to frame the narrative as the result of instability, grief, and obsession, attempting to soften the perception of intent. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses, especially Jennifer herself, made the true nature of the crime impossible to deny. The captor's calm demeanor, once a facade in public, dissolved in the courtroom, revealing the tension and fragility that had underpinned months of horror. Outside the courtroom, Harrisonburg watched with collective attention. Local news covered the trial in painstaking detail, capturing the faces of the family, the intensity of the legal proceedings, and the emotional stakes. Community members reflected on their role in the town's vigilance, recognizing how ordinary lives could intersect with extraordinary darkness, and how quickly normalcy could be shattered. The verdict, when it came, was a release of tension as much as a declaration of justice. Guilty on all counts, the captor faced sentences that would ensure he could never harm another. The weight of his actions, measured against the months of fear and suffering, was laid bare in the judgment of the court. For Jennifer and her family, the verdict was both a closure and a reminder of what had been endured, a mixture of relief, lingering trauma, and the knowledge that life would continue, irrevocably altered. The aftermath was a time of careful, deliberate healing. Jennifer returned home, gradually reclaiming her independence and her sense of self. Her family, once fractured by the pain of loss and complicated relationships, grew closer through the shared experience of fear, hope, and reunion. Ordinary routines were reestablished, yet now tempered with the knowledge of life's fragility and the necessity of vigilance. For the town of Harrisonburg, the trial and its resolution served as both warning and reassurance. The invisible dangers within ordinary spaces were acknowledged, yet the outcome reinforced the belief that truth, diligence, and justice could prevail. The community collectively exhaled. A tension held for months released, even as memories of the ordeal lingered quietly in the background. Jennifer's recovery, while ongoing, was testament to human resilience. She reclaimed her freedom not through forgetting, but through conscious, deliberate steps toward autonomy, engagement with friends and family, and the reclamation of spaces that had once been tainted by fear. Her spirit, vibrant, chaotic, and free, returned gradually, each small victory a reaffirmation of life and agency. And while the shadow of the captor's actions remained, it no longer dictated the rhythm of days or the contours of her existence. The trial had delivered legal closure, but more profoundly, it allowed Jennifer, her family, and the town to begin a process of emotional resolution, a recognition of horror endured, survival achieved, and justice finally served. Time, as it always does, began to carry life forward. The months after the trial were slower, quieter, marked by the careful reconstruction of ordinary days. For Jennifer Quinn, freedom was no longer an abstract concept. It was something tangible, something she had fought for and reclaimed with every step she took outside her home, every decision to re-engage with the world, and every moment spent rebuilding the trust and connections that had been shattered. Her family, who had been fractured by old tensions and complicated dynamics, emerged from the ordeal changed. The months of fear, hope, and relief had forged a bond stronger than any they had experienced before. Arguments that once seemed monumental now felt trivial. Disagreements were tempered by the memory of shared vulnerability and the knowledge of what mattered most. They were together, not just in proximity, but in understanding, empathy, and love. A family reshaped by adversity, yet resilient and united. Jennifer herself carried the visible and invisible marks of her ordeal, yet she refused to let them define her. She approached life with a cautious intensity, learning to trust again, reclaiming spaces once tainted by fear, and surrounding herself with people who honored her autonomy. The world had not been entirely cruel. There had been those who searched tirelessly, those who offered support, and those who believed in her even when she was absent. These truths became a foundation for healing, a reminder that even after darkness, light could return. Harrisonburg, too, had changed, though in subtler ways. The quiet town had been forced to reckon with the fragility beneath its ordinary rhythm. Community members became more attentive, more aware, more protective, not in fear alone, but in care. The case of Jennifer Quinn became a reference point, a story whispered in local cafes and classrooms, a cautionary tale about the ordinary turned sinister, and the power of resilience and collective responsibility. Jennifer's survival and return became a symbol in her own life and for those around her. Her story was not solely one of victimhood. It was a story of endurance, courage, and reclamation. Every moment she walked freely, every laugh that returned, every step back into normalcy was a defiance of the months that had sought to contain her, silence her, and diminish her light. The shadows of trauma remained, yes, but they existed alongside growth, strength, and the quiet reclamation of autonomy. Her family's experience also became a story of reflection and transformation. They had learned to navigate grief, hope, and fear in a compressed, intense timeline. They had been forced to confront their vulnerabilities, to rely on one another, and to recognize that love could be an anchor even in the darkest times. The ordeal had reshaped their understanding of themselves and each other, reminding them that family is both fragile and indestructible, capable of being broken and remade with intentional care. For Jennifer, healing was a gradual, personal process. She did not define it by formal therapy sessions, though she sought support in different forms. Instead, she reclaimed agency over her life in her own ways. Reconnecting with friends, returning to favorite spaces, creating routines that honored her freedom, and finding joy in small, deliberate acts became her path forward. Her strength was not a sudden declaration, but a quiet accumulation of choices, each step a reaffirmation of life and selfhood. The town, her family, and Jennifer herself began to understand that the legacy of her experience was complex. There was pain, certainly, and the scars of captivity and betrayal, but there was also resilience, unity, and hope. The story of the ordinary man who had hidden in plain sight and the extraordinary courage of the young woman he had taken became intertwined, a narrative of danger, survival, and the possibility of justice prevailing. Harrisonburg slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, yet it retained the memory of disruption, vigilance, and the capacity for collective care. Jennifer's family grew closer, bonds strengthened by shared adversity and tempered by gratitude. Jennifer herself emerged as a quiet beacon of endurance and demonstrating the possibility of reclaiming life after unspeakable trauma. In the quiet moments, the streets, the homes, the parks, and the spaces Jennifer had once walked freely became symbolic. They were no longer just ordinary places. They were markers of survival, of resilience, and of the human capacity to endure. The town, her family, and Jennifer herself carried forward a narrative that was no longer only about loss and fear, but about reclamation, justice, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And so, the story of Jennifer Quinn became more than a case. It became a testament to survival, a reflection on family, community, and the transformative power of hope. It reminded everyone who knew her or heard her story that even in the darkest chapters there is the possibility of light, and even after tragedy, life can be reclaimed, reshaped, and lived fully again. Time had a way of smoothing the edges of tragedy, but it never erased the memory of what had happened. For Jennifer Quinn, life resumed its rhythm, not as though nothing had occurred, but with the awareness that ordinary days could carry extraordinary significance. Every morning, every laugh, every moment spent freely was now underscored by a quiet gratitude, a recognition of survival, and the resilience that had carried her through months of fear and captivity. Her family, once fractured by the complexities of ordinary life, now carried a bond forged in crisis. They had confronted uncertainty together, navigated fear and hope, and endured the slow, grinding tension of 6 months in which a daughter and sister was missing. Those months had changed them. They spoke with more patience, understood one another more deeply, and cherished each interaction with a new appreciation for the fragility of life. The ordeal had been a catalyst, exposing vulnerabilities but also building strength, a reminder that love, when tested, could become unbreakable. Harrisonburg, too, retained a subtle but permanent change. The ordinary streets, the familiar parks, the quiet cafes were no longer merely backdrops. They were reminders of vigilance, of care, and of the invisible struggles that could be occurring behind closed doors. The town, its residents, and even casual passers-by had been touched by Jennifer's story. The lessons of her ordeal woven quietly into the fabric of daily life. Community awareness, empathy, and the recognition that justice sometimes moves slowly but eventually prevails became part of the town's collective consciousness. Jennifer herself emerged as a living testament to endurance. The trauma she endured was real, the scars both physical and emotional, yet they did not define her. She reclaimed her spaces, both literal and symbolic, with care, returning to friendships, favorite places, and routines that reminded her she belonged to the world once more. Her laughter, once muted by fear and uncertainty, gradually returned, tempered by experience but no less genuine. She understood the fragility of life, the danger of misplaced trust, and the strength that comes from surviving the unimaginable. The captor, whose ordinary life had concealed extraordinary cruelty, was behind bars, a reminder of how appearances can be deceiving, and how vigilance, investigation, and perseverance can bring hidden truths to light. Justice had been served, though it could not erase the trauma. It could not give back months lost, but it could prevent the cycle from repeating. For Jennifer, the resolution was not solely legal. It was personal. It was the reclamation of her autonomy, her safety, and her voice, which she now wielded with cautious strength. The events of those 6 months rippled outward, touching not only Jennifer and her family, but the broader community. They reminded people that life could change in an instant, that ordinary settings could hide extraordinary danger, and that resilience often emerges in response to unimaginable hardship. Jennifer's story became a quiet emblem of survival, a narrative that combined horror with hope, despair with courage, and darkness with the possibility of light. As the years passed, Jennifer's experiences remained a part of her, but they did not dictate the entirety of her life. She pursued passions, nurtured relationships, and allowed herself to trust again, carefully and deliberately. Her family continued to grow closer, a unit reshaped by adversity and strengthened by shared survival. Harrisonburg, meanwhile, moved forward, carrying with it the lessons learned from the invisible struggles of one young woman whose absence had reminded them all of the value of vigilance, empathy, and care. Jennifer Quinn's story, once a tale of disappearance and fear, had transformed into a testament of survival, justice, and healing. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human resilience, familial love, and unwavering perseverance can lead to reclamation of life, restoration of trust, and the possibility of moving forward. The memory of what happened remained, but it existed alongside growth, freedom, and a future reclaimed from the shadows of the past. And so the tale of Jennifer Quinn closes not merely with the end of a crime, but with the enduring power of survival, the quiet triumph of justice, and the luminous resilience of a young woman who faced darkness, endured it, and emerged to live fully once more.